Hey everybody, welcome to API Days New York Virtual Edition. My name's Tony Blank. I'm head of community at Orbit Love, coming to you live from Denver, Colorado. And I wish that we could be in New York. I really wish, because there's such a great agenda, such a great content out there today. But I'm thrilled for the privilege to introduce Rakshith Rouse, co-founder and CEO of APIwiz, who's here today to talk about how open banking builds revolutionary banks in the cloud. How are you doing today, Rakshith?
Awesome. I'm super energized. I was actually following the keynote and the presentation so far. It's a miss that we're not there in person. Likewise, I share your sentiments, but nothing lost, nothing short of getting excited to talk to the other folks.
Right on, right on. Well, the stage is yours, so I will let you take it away.
Thank you, Tony. Good morning, folks, and good afternoon or good evening, depending on wherever you're joining in from the rest of the world, or if you're watching this on a more of a recorded session later on. Uh, the earlier parts of the session was quite interesting, where we actually got to see a lot of how open banking, digital banking is something that we are seeing as completely changing the yardstick in terms of how APIs are really powering the businesses specifically globally, not just in any one part of the world anymore. So, given that, I thought I'll take the next 20 minutes and share a bit more detail around what are we seeing as trends in terms of how open banking is changing the landscape, and some thoughts on how successful ones have really gone down the path of taking full benefit of this. Before we really jump in, see, this is an interesting area, right? Where you hear a lot of terms like neo banking, virtual banking, challenger banks. So I thought maybe before I dive head first, make sure in the interest of everybody, to just clarify some of the nuances and the differences between what we see as neobanks, digital banks, and how all of this really comes together. Uh, uh, Pretty much, best of the things are really more focused on: do you have a banking license, or you don't have a banking license? Or if you're really building on top of a banking license, do you have the ability to bring to market with being cloud first, app only kind of a thing? Or you're an existing enterprise, existing bank, or either shifting, changing, or morphing yourself, or building completely new experiences on digital banks. I thought maybe this will be a clear way to make sure that we all understand and we're all on the same page. Next thing was the open banking itself. So it's if you've read and if you've not read, there has been a ton of topics that really cover open banking in a lot of details and depth. And to be frank, it's not new, and it's been around for quite a while now, just like how APIs have been there for decades. So open banking as a concept has really helped change and bring about some revolutionary aspects in terms of deregularizing some of the things, or removing the entry barriers for new people to participate. What initially started out in certain parts of the world, open banking, PSD2, and PSD3 now, and it held a lot of promise. It delivered to quite a good extent, and there is a lot more coming in. End of the day, it made sure that when somebody said, "Hey, it's a great bank, you should work with them," it was a lot built on trust and a lot built on our ability to work with an established banking system and trusted our data and our financial assets, and made sure that we could take full benefit of that. But with the open banking, and especially what COVID has taught us in the last 2 years, is things can be completely virtual. And just like how these conferences were virtual for quite some time before we came back to a hybrid model, we ran, operated, and we survived through that. So, which means there are new ways in which people can do banking and take banking services through established channels, new channels, and a lot of them just morphed over a time quickly to make themselves available in these new channels. Given all of this only meant that you could literally look at new ways in which you could provide the flexibility for customers to choose how and what they really wanted to do with their data and where they wanted to bank and at what time and with who. See, these really change the whole ecosystem in terms of bringing together various providers to make this happen. And guess what? Open banking were built on an API first mindset. And it was just like what we thought as a mechanism or a technology aspect for a long time became a business driver. And regulations were also enforced. So the frameworks were created. So that really brought us to the next crossroads of how and what do we do with these kinds of data. And if you really ask anybody, this is a short list, and people can bombard me on the channel here and say what more they're actually using it for. If I just wrangle my head, uh, these were some of the key use cases that I could just think of and I was just jotting down. And by no means these are the exhaustive list of the open banking use cases. You pick and choose any aspect of banking service could really follow through. While it started out as a framework, any part of the banking system can now be made available as a service, as a use case for anybody else to reach out there and use. Fintechs, insurtechs, new use cases by other neobanks. So if you see, this essentially fast tracked the ability for people to really use the open banking as the core backbone for building their business on top. And the data only speaks to itself. And this is just one example, but if you really see, there are a lot more examples which really talk about how a third-party usage of the open banking data available as services and APIs being used. It's exponentially grown. And trust me when I say this, COVID has really fast-tracked the adoption. What was once thought as, hey, we'll come to it when it's required, or when we'll get there, or we are making transformation and we are going through a journey, we definitely have this as a milestone, we'll get to that, was all fast tracked in the last 2 years. And this was the only way for which the banking and services could really be made available. So, and the trend is only growing even after things have been getting better. It was not just that only during COVID that we saw the surge and it's going to subside anytime soon. What has happened is, like somebody said once to me, that do something for 30 days and you get used to it and becomes your core norm. I think so. We all gotten used to the new way of, we've taken things for granted now, and the luxury has crept in, which only means that we are putting pressure back on banking ecosystem and the providers to really now up the game. So the numbers are only supposed to grow to the right. And looking at the US Open banking, I was just taking a looking at one of the Everett Rogers law of diffusion of innovation. It's right to say that now we have hit the tipping point. Uh, while the regulatory push or not, the convenience and the customer expectation has only made this really happen a lot quicker and faster. While there are many reports to point to the North Star, which says that this is the way to go, and hearing some of the key speakers before me when they were talking about open banking in API as a mindset, it's very clear that every large enterprise is thinking about doing this and underway in some form or shape. And a lot of the times, we also need to understand that while we are at this, there are certain things that we need to keep in mind. And this was from Deloitte, which I pulled out, where it's really talking about some of the major concerns as well, because it's not hunky dory and it's not like, oh, great, we're all opening things up and everybody is out there waiting through the doors to receivers, and we are going to have an exponential revenue stream. We are going to have a manifold increase in terms of customer adoption. While all of that is true, there is also certain aspects of this which act as road humps. So we need to clearly keep these in mind, because customer does have an anxiety in terms of what's really happening with my data. And Am I losing control of this? I'm actually giving consent to a provider to use my data to provide me a financial service. While all of that is great, how are they handling it? Where are they storing it? Do I have an ability to pull back my consent? And what happens when I take that consent back? Would I be guaranteed that the data is actually purged and not stored somewhere else? And what if I do something by mistake? And does that lead to not just loss of data, but financial loss as well? Can somebody use this to go gain unnatural access to my accounts and take out money or do transactions on my behalf? So, man of the middle attacks, spoofs, a lot of this is where there's an anxiety. So, when we go about addressing some of the key areas, there has to be a well thought through strategy. And in my opinion, of having worked with small, large neobanks and digital banks across the globe, there are certain aspects of which I want to bring to table in terms of what are the real successful things that need to be kept in mind for a successful open banking program. To begin with, making sure that you're doing this with a proper strategy in mind. When I say strategy, it's not a strategy on a paper and you can fire and forget it or put it on the pin board and never come back to revisit it. It's more about really thinking about what's in it for the organization and why are we actually driving this one and what key benefits are we really trying to do those. And if you want to make that really happen, you also want to make sure that what's your capacity today to go on board and work with providers, whether it's small or large, or long tail developer, or an external partner, or a large bank by itself? What's your mechanism of making sure that the services are something that's available for people to really look at and onboard and get started with? Do they have an ability for them to play around? They have an ability to subscribe for stuff? Does it require human intervention, or is it something that is self-service by nature? I'm not saying one is better than the other, but it's more about making sure that do you have this well thought through? Because I have seen certain things which could be self-service, but certain aspects of a large partnership, or if you're going to be doing a multi-million-dollar deal with another enterprise, you're going to have a white cloud treatment. The way in which you work and what you do for those will be based on some of the core elements, but the approach should not make it too hard or completely change what you've actually built things on. Things needs to be well thought through in terms of governance. Governance, like people call this as, is this something that's going to slow things down, or is it something that's going to help me fast track? Because what's been thought through for a long time is governance is seen as the gatekeeper or mechanisms through which you make it so hard for people to really innovate that you stop really innovating. So this is something that you need to think about as, does this come out in such a way that you are providing guardrails rather than the safety nets to make sure that things don't really go wrong in the approach that you're allowing people to innovate? And the other part to keenly think about is, from a technology standpoint, how is it really going to come together? And on what are you basing some of these aspects? Are you leveraging some of the latest and greatest in terms of technology trends and practices, whether it is microservices, cloud native principles? While they're very easy to get carried away with, it's about making sure that you're having a fine balance between trying to leverage something that is sustainable for you to work with, rather than locking yourself up with an architecture that begs you to rechange in a couple of years. Because the idea here is, think about it. You're letting something go out of the door. The floodgates are open. So which means you need to be able to handle a swarm of traffic which was not there yesterday. Even though you can controllably release it, but at some point the program is going to take off. So the architecture decisions you make, technology decisions you make, does not slow you down, and it allows you to also make sure that you don't carry a lot of technical debt in while doing what you're doing. And when you make those architecture decisions and you start designing and building, it's there are a lot of best practices people talk about API first, design first. While they're all great, doing this as a hygiene on an ongoing basis is hard. If you think API first is what you're supposed to be doing, then design first is quite obvious. Because without you locking in your design and contracts in place, you cannot allow various parts of your API lifecycle to multi-thread and go work in parallel. Because everything comes back to this as, do you have something from a strategy? Does it translate to a design? And from the same design, does it translate to your services, which is actually functioning and living and breathing the core principles and the KPIs why you even went down this path? And making sure that you, while you're doing it, you obviously are going to have some hiccups. You're going to make sure that whether it is teams, internally, externally, how do you support and make sure that you learn and have a data driven approach to support people who are actually using them. That way you can excel at what you're really doing. Uh, One key principle which I've learned over the years is automation is not a fancy thing, and it's not a niche which is only tied to a few corners of the office where only a few people can actually do this. Driving through automation gives you phenomenal benefit, and everybody understands this. But the extent to which you can automate differentiates between success and failure. Your ability to do multiple releases every day or do an A/B release. Try to experiment with various business models, charging models, ability to see what works, what does not work. Some of these aspects are fairly hard to get right from day one. But if you have a mechanism through which you can actually automate the heck out of it, will give you the flexibility from a business side and from the technology side or an IT side to make sure that you can pinpoint and see what release, what came out, who's getting impacted, what notifications you need to send out. How do you make sure that they are all backward compatible? And even if you're deprecating something, people know this well in advance. And it's not a rude surprise when one of your core business partner services go down because they were using an older version of your service and you just forgot to update them that it's actually going out of service in a couple of weeks. So that's going to be a root shock, and nobody's going to be prepared for that. Last but not the least, there are various ways to think about it. You build it, they'll come, does not always work. So you need to be able to make sure that you can allow people to actually come, experiment, and see. So evangelizing this on various platforms and making sure that your banking services are available in all forms and shapes is going to be fundamentally differentiating in terms of adoption, because production of the services and APIs and everything is all great. With zero consumption on the other side, the whole API program is really going to collapse. So this is what we see as like eight principles which we see as important for people to really make this stuff happen. And coming down to the hard parts of leveraging technologies, you really need to really think about where you're building, where you're hosting. So leveraging cloud is imperative, and making sure you make design decisions of what sits where and the cloud proximity to where your consumers are, and how do you make sure that you're leveraging some of the key technologies are very important. Also, keeping in mind that you're managing all of these APIs as products is very, very important. Because what happens is if you do not think about them as products, if you're building APIs as technology, then you are in real trouble. So, taking your core domain specific services and APIs, creating them as API products to begin with, and managing them as a lifecycle is very, very important. And one of the things that we see very important is while we are doing all of this, having a unified API lifecycle platform really helps, because for you to have a successful API distribution strategy, and sometimes it's compliance, sometimes about it's partnership, innovation, forging, and adoption. Other times it's a lot about making sure that what you're doing, you have the peace of mind that they're quite secure, compliant, and consistent with both organizational policies and the operational policies, environments of where you're actually operating. But last but not the least, the most important part is it adding value to give you a differentiated customer experience? Because everything just boils down to that. If you're building services with no clear line of sight in terms of making sure that you can actually deliver this, then it becomes a big bottleneck. And if you double click and see from an API lifecycle, I'm just using a standard CI, CD, and mechanism of a lifecycle. But few key aspects to keep in mind is there is no joy in having too many tools and technologies that you can work with just because they are the best and the greatest. Because end of the day, somebody has to support them, somebody has to run them, manage them. These become a challenge of its own. So make sure that when you're choosing the technologies for running your API lifecycle, they are quite unified, they work with one another, and you have a single pane of glass. Because without a single pane of glass, you would essentially be working off with bits and pieces of information that become a roadblock for teams not knowing what they're pushing to production, when, where, and what's happening with those. And an organization that I work with, APIwiz, essentially focuses on some of these founding principles, which where we have tried to imbibe to say, how do we make sure that we are not building something that is siloed? You're making sure that if you're building from scratch, or if you're trying to build a digital bank as a new initiative, building them on technologies that will give you a future proofing from underlying pieces of technology is going to give you a peace of mind that it's sustainable, and making sure that you're not adding people just because you need the new skill sets will help drive more momentum and lesser moving parts so that you focus more on getting the velocity and feature release from your open banking perspective, but also making sure that you are doing it with peace of mind that regulatory compliances, governance, and security are not an afterthought, because you're not pushing something out there and making sure that, hey, let's do a scan and figure out that how many of these services are compliant. Do we have 5,000 services, 50,000 services? The things do not change, because with the more, the complexity only just grows manifold. So you need to make sure that keeping some of these building blocks in mind, you are building something that's allowing people to innovate along with a decoupled control plane so that the underlying technology does not change your open banking strategy. Because what you're going back to the founding principles, what we start before, you're building this for adoption. You're building this with as a strategy to grow your business. So technology should not slow you down. So that's where the key principles of what uh, any low-code platform really helps drive the productivity, reliability, and all the automation you need so that you can run your open banking strategy at scale. So that was a. I tried to keep it as short as I could, but in case I'm more than happy to take more questions and thoughts. Tony, if there are anything that you see from folks adding it on here.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Some really great tips for opening up banking. I have a question for you to get things kicked off here, and if anyone else has any questions, just drop them in the chat. Some great best practices. I kind of like to look and hear stories of what not to do. So, have you heard of all of the things that you've mentioned? What would you say like the biggest pitfall would be for a financial institution who wants to open up their APIs? Like, what's the one thing they should not do?
So if you ask me, one of the things that they should not do is making sure that governance and compliance is not an afterthought. Because a lot of the times what they do is in the hurry to make sure that they can get things out of the door, making sure that they can actually go and get people to work with them, they're always in a mad rush. So making sure that having some of these governance and compliance and stuff being seamlessly done behind the scene so that developers and business don't have to really make this as one of the key stages that somebody says, let's say, let's stop everything, let's do a 2 week to 4 week kind of sprint. And that's one of the things I see as a pitfall that there should not be left for us to thought.
Gotcha. Awesome. Awesome. Well, some great things to think about there. So thank you all for watching Rakshith's talk today. Definitely check out the Partner Village. We got some great content coming up the rest of today, and enjoy the rest of the conference.